Hey friends, how are you doing today? I hope you're feeling blessed and staying in God's presence, and if not, I hope you feel uplifted after today's video. If you're new here, welcome to his Princess Christian community where we read a chapter of the Bible every day and then discuss it afterwards and in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and it opens the door for more people to join our community. And while you're at it, check out the description box. We got a lot of great stuff in there. So today we're reading Genesis chapter 41, but before we get started, I want to say a prayer if you wouldn't mind bowing your heads with me. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together here on his Princess Christian community. Thank you for opening the door for people to join our community, for connecting us and strengthening our bond. Thank you for opening our eyes, our ears, our hearts, and our minds to your word. Thank you for your wisdom, understanding, and clarity as we seek to interpret your word. And thank you for the courage to apply it to our daily lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, Genesis chapter 41. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and began grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up, but he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. "Today I have been reminded of my failure," he told Pharaoh. "Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant, and everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it." "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied, "but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. "In my dream," he said, "I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterwards you wouldn't have known it, for they were still as thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean." Joseph responded, "Both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterwards there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and he will soon make them happen. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, these famines will destroy the land. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Pharaoh, the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. As predicted, for 7 years the land produced bumper crops. During those years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. He piled up huge amounts of grain like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was too much to measure. During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife. Asenath, the daughter of Pharaoh, the priest of On. Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my troubles and everything in my father's family." Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief." At last the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end. Then the 7 years of famine began. Just as Joseph had predicted, the famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt as well. And when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." So with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. Amen. So what did you think of Genesis chapter 41? I'm interested to hear about it in the comments below. Let me know what your insights or interpretations were on the chapter. Maybe comment your favorite verse, or just say hi and let us know that you're part of the community. And if you've been blessed lately, let us know so that we can rejoice with you. And if you need prayer, make sure you're putting that in the comments too so we can pray together as a community. Okay, so this is where it starts to get good for Joseph. This section is entitled Pharaoh's Dream. And I wrote off to the side, "The good you are doing will not be unrewarded. Patiently endure." So Joseph was faithful and obedient to God, and eventually, once he had learned the things that God wanted him to learn, in God's perfect timing, at just the right time, God put Joseph in a position to be elevated. So Pharaoh had a dream, and then he fell asleep again and had a second dream. So we had two different dreams, similar situations. One was about calves. We had the skinny calves and then the fat calves. The skinny calves ate the fat calves, but they remained skinny. Then you had I think it was grain. Yeah, heads of grain. One, healthy, the other shriveled up. The shriveled up consumed the healthy and remained shriveled up. So you have these two different dreams, and he woke up, he realized it's a dream. He was very disturbed. He called for all the magicians and the wise men. He asked, all these people, like, what does this dream mean? None of them could tell him what they meant. So finally the king cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure. So again, God will remind people to remember you. So sometimes in your mind, God will put people on your mind, and it's like, hey, this person is on my mind. God put that person on your mind for a reason. Sometimes the enemy does too, so be careful. Remember the type of position. So remember the situation. Stay close to God. Ask God, is this you? Is this you putting this on my mind? Obviously, this situation was so apparent to him. So he says that, today I have been reminded of my failure. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me. He told him how they were imprisoned, how Joseph interpreted their dreams, and everything happened just as he predicted. And so at the perfect time, he remembered what happened with Joseph. And I think that it's important that it says 2 full years later, Joseph's dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the river Nile. So this was 2 years later. So the cupbearer had forgot him for 2 whole years. And so it's important to just recognize that 2 years later, he had forgotten him. So then it says that he remembered 2 years later. So again, you may feel completely forgotten, but God will remind people of you. In God's perfect timing, the things that you are doing are not going to waste. You may feel like it's been forever. Why isn't anything changing for me? Why am I not being noticed? Why isn't this prayer being answered? But sometimes God is working things out. He had to wait for the perfect time. If cupbearer had have remembered him at that time, it may not have had an effect on Pharaoh. Pharaoh might not have cared. He might have said, who cares about this little Hebrew guy, who thinks that he's innocent? Who cares about him? But in this situation, when he was caused to remember him, he was beneficial to Pharaoh. So it made it a lot more important at that time. That's when it would have impact. So sometimes, if people remember you when you want them to, it might not have the impact that God needs it to have, or the impact to make the change that needs to be done. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. He called Joseph in, and he says, but I've heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. So Pharaoh is trying to give Joseph the glory. And I love how immediately Joseph said, I can't do that, but God can. And so it's important to recognize that all your gifts, all the blessings that you have in your life come from God, and make sure that you are not accepting the glory for those things. Make sure that you are giving God the glory, and just exhibit humility in those situations. Like, it's not me, it's God. Like, this is God. And the more you grow closer to God, and the more God makes you aware of who you are, you'll realize that it is all God, that God is doing all of it. And so then he tells him the dream, and Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. And so again, this is another thing that God shows you kind of what is ahead. We just have to take heed and listen and start doing the things that God has asked us to do. We want God to, write us a letter, kind of send us an email or text message so that we can kind of look back over it. But God tells us in advance. We get these feelings or dreams, or maybe I should start preparing for this, or we have these concerns about stuff, and then we don't act upon them, and then we wonder, well, why didn't God tell me this was going to happen? Or then we get to the end and he says, man, I knew something like this was going to happen. Why didn't I prepare for it? Why didn't I act differently? So we have to realize that God tells us in advance of what is going to happen to us most all the time. We just have to be willing to listen. So then it says, he explains to him that there will be a famine. He says, he said there will be a famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. the next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity, but afterwards there'll be 7 years of famine, and the famine will destroy the land. The famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. And I underline this because I believe that a lot of the times when we go through bad times, it makes us forget about all the good times that happened when we're not prepared for it. So you have to be prepared for the bad times by remembering the good times. So do well in the good times to prepare for the bad times so that you don't forget. And I think this lesson is so important in our daily lives today that sometimes, we get in the bad times. When the good times happen, we get so wrapped up in the good that we're not storing up for when the bad times happen. And I mentioned this in a lot of my videos about, make sure you have your war situation ready. Like, do you have those praise songs you sing? Do you have those scriptures memorized? Do you have, prayers written down or, recorded for you to respond to? Do you have like go-to things to do when you're under attack? We don't want to not remember the good times. Are you listing out your, how do you have a gratitude journal so that you can go back and read over all the good things that God has done? Because the enemy will try to put you in a place where your bad feels so bad that you ignore the good and you don't remember the good anymore. So it says, as for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and he will soon make them happen. So I wrote off to the side confirmation because God is really good about providing confirmation for things. We'll see things start to stack up in our lives that are all pointing in the same direction. God makes things to where we cannot ignore them. I heard this in a sermon or in a video recently where it says that when you have to, you ask yourself, is this God? Like you see that in the Bible. You see a lot of times in the Bible where people are like, is this God? And God always provides confirmation. So whenever you are questioning, is this God? If you have no confirmation after that, that is just so obvious, then no, it's not. But God will give you confirmation. See, the enemy likes to plant a seed in your mind and then you run away with it and make it and make it so. But God gives you confirmation. So we'll have a lot of things that'll pop up in your life that are all pointing in the same direction, whether you want to accept it or not. It may not be something that you want to see. A famine is not something that you may want to see in your life, but God will point things in this direction to say, this is what is going to happen. I wrote off to the side Deuteronomy 19:15. It says, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. So again, confirmation. So God is going to give you multiple witnesses to the things that he is going to display or show in your life. We just have to be willing to see them and willing to listen to them. So in this case, he gave Pharaoh 2 dreams, 2 witnesses to what was getting ready to happen. And the same thing will be true for us. So then he says, therefore, so then after Joseph interprets the dream, then he tells Joseph what to do about it. Then he tells Joseph tells Pharaoh what to do about it. So I said, I wrote off to the side, knowledge tells you what's going on. Wisdom tells you what to do about it. So a lot of the times you'll see like, this is what's going to happen, or God will put on your mind, like, this is what's going to happen. But we also have to ask God for the wisdom to how to respond to the knowledge that we've been given. The Bible is full of knowledge, but we need wisdom to interpret it and wisdom to apply it to our lives. So in this case, he tells him to collect 1/5 of the crops during the good years, and that will be enough to sustain them in the bad. And I think this is a great lesson that we should all have in our lives, to remember that a lot of the times when things are good in our lives, maybe you have an increase of funds, our first instinct may be to spend it all, but it's important that we are saving and preparing for bad times, as well. And that's when you have that balance in your life. You see a lot of people like, I never have balance. Either it's really good or really bad. So you need to create that balance in your life by saving up some of those good things for bad. That's why they say moderation is so important. And I say this, okay, in all simplicity, you'll get like maybe a box of cookies and they'll be so good. And instead of just having like one today and then one tomorrow and then the box lasts for, weeks, you'll end up eating the whole box in 2 days. And then when it's gone, you'll wonder why you don't have any more. And I know this is just like a simplistic, maybe you've never been in that type of situation because you're really good with self-control. It's something that I've had to learn in my life, but this is the case in a lot of things. You'll have a TV show that you like to watch and you'll binge it all in one weekend and then be sad because then tomorrow it's like, oh, it's over and I missed, the characters of the show. What are they doing? When you could have, took the slow road and only watched, an episode a day, and then it lasted a lot longer. So you have to realize that, the enemy wants us to consume like that. He wants us to consume everything that we have all at once. Tomorrow's not promised. Consume everything now. But God wants us also to remember that there will be good times and bad, and we have to prepare for the bad during the good times. So it is important to save. It's important to, moderate the things that we have and not to be gluttonous and be greedy when things are good, and to save up some of those good times for when there are bad times. So in this case, I love how it says, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? And, people will recognize that you are irreplaceable. God will put you in positions where you cannot be replaced. We're so quick to compare ourselves with other people and to say, well, I don't do things like that and I'm not like them. But maybe that's for a reason. Maybe that's because God wants you to be different. God is setting you apart for a reason. He's setting you apart because he's going to put you in a place where they won't be able to find anyone else like you or who's doing what you are doing. And they will be able to see that's because you are Spirit-filled by God. So then he says that clearly no one else is intelligence as wise as you are. You will be in charge. So he puts him in charge. He says, no one will be higher than you than me. Higher than you, it's me. He says, only I sitting on my throne will have a higher rank than yours. So this man Joseph went from being his father's favorite to being a slave. Then he went from being a slave to being in charge of Potiphar's entire house. Then he went to being a prisoner. Then he got elevated to being in charge of the prison, to being in charge of the entire land of Egypt. And that progression is amazing to think about, the progression that he went through. And just when you feel stagnant and stuck, sometimes we feel stagnant and stuck in our situations. We need to figure out what are those skills that God is seeking that we learn so that we can then be promoted. And sometimes we've learned all the skills that we need to learn. We're just waiting on God's perfect timing. God had a perfect timing. This is when the famine was going to come up. This is when God needed him and used him in this situation. This was the perfect timing for him to be promoted. So we need to just recognize that and just be patient and patiently endure whatever we're going through. And it says, whenever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. So he put him in that position. He removed his signet ring and placed it on Joseph's finger. And that signet ring, I wrote off to the side a couple of other scriptures that we see where we are, as people of God, are God's signet ring. So it's a representation of his authority over the land. So we are a representation of God's authority by the way that we act and live. So then it says, then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name, and I put off to the side new name just to remind myself that throughout the Bible, we see people who are given a new name. In this case, God isn't giving him this new name. God gave him this new position, but Pharaoh gave him a new name. And I like Joseph better because it's easier to pronounce. But, and then this is where it says he was 30 years old when he began serving the court of the Pharaoh. So a couple days ago, I mentioned the amount of time that it took Pharaoh. So he was 17 years old when he was sold as a slave. And then he wasn't promoted over all of Egypt until he was 30 years old. So it's important to recognize the amount of time that took. That was 13 years. So 11 years, he pretty much, I think it was like 11 years he was serving as a slave, and then 2 years we know that he was in prison. So, think about the amount of time that you're in your waiting period, or you're in between, or you're waiting to be promoted. Joseph waited 13 years to get to the place that he could fulfill the dream that God placed on his heart when he was 17 years old. So have some patience, and patience is really hard for me, but I'm learning to just accept what God is doing. For me, it's more like, okay, so what is that going to look like? His dream was like, okay, your family's going to bow down to you. Okay, but why? Like, what kind of position am I going to be in when my family's going to bow down to me? So that's why sometimes it's important not to share your dreams with other people, and not to hold too much stock, because I doubt that when he was given that dream that Joseph ever thought that he was going to be in charge of the land of Egypt. Like, that probably never crossed his mind. And so I think it's important for us not to try to hold on too tight to the details of our dream, because God will make your dream sometimes a place or a goal, a place just to get you on that path that you need to get. So, that dream to get you on that path that you need to get, and the dream will change. The details of the dream, or how he's going to work it out, will change in so many ways that you'll get to a place where it's like you never imagined this would be where you would end up. So it's just all about being obedient to God and making the best of whatever position God places you in along the way. So then it says, as he predicted, they had 7 years of bumper crops, which was prosperity. They had all this prosperity, and during those times he gathered all the crops, and he piled them up piled the grain. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was too much to measure. And how blessed is that, to have so much that it's too much to measure? And this is often a prayer of mine, like, Lord, bless me to where it's too much for me to keep count of. It's too much for me to measure. It's too much for me to pay attention to. It's so much that, and that's what we should be seeking in our lives, to, be storing up our blessings to where there's too many to count, to where it's like, man, I could write my gratitude all day long because I have so many things to be grateful for. It's too much to measure, too much to count. So it's, that's the kind of expectation that we should have. And it says, during this time before the famine years, he had 2 sons during this time. And I love how the first son he named, God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. So, I wrote off to the side, God, help me to forget and make me fruitful. Like, this is what God will do in your life. He won't replace the evil years. I think it's Psalms 90:15. It's one of my favorites. It says that, God replaced the evil years with good. Give me prosperity or generosity in proportion to my former misery. Replace all the bad things with good. And I think that balance is so important. So in this chapter, we have 7 years of prosperity and then 7 years of famine. But because they were so good in the years of prosperity, they didn't even recognize the years of famine, where the enemy wanted, as we read in verse 31, it says the famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. So you can have 2 different paths in life. You can have the path where, your famine will be so great that you won't even remember all the good. Or you can listen to God and be obedient to God, and God can make you forget all your troubles. So the famine you won't even be affected by the famine. And that's the kind of the difference that you have in life and in people, is either you go through life with God and don't even recognize the famine, or you're not affected by the famine, or you are prepared for the famine to where God makes you forget all your troubles and all the bad things that happen in your life. Or you can be in a position where, that the famine makes you forget all the bad things. The famine makes you forget all the good things. So it says that God, so then his second son, he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief. And I just love that God can put you in a position. So he was sold into this position. So he put him in a position of grief. And I want to highlight that because, again, a lot of people try to say, well, Joseph never complained. We never hear about Joseph complaining, just because in the book of Job, you have Job, complaining throughout pretty much the whole book. But in this book, you don't really hear Joseph complaining. But it is highlighted that he was in a state of grief. So while it doesn't speak out like Joseph complaining, you don't see verses in verses about Joseph complaining, that you have to realize this was the land of his grief. He was not in a position where he was just joyful and content throughout this whole time, but he was obedient and faithful to God, and God's blessing shined upon him. He was in grief. So remember that in your place, in that place that God is preparing you, it may be a place of grief. It may be a place that you don't want to be. He didn't want to be a slave or be a prisoner. Even if you're at the best position in that place, that may not be the place that you want to be or that God is intending for you to stay. So realize that you don't have to stay where you're at. Like, you just have to be there for right now. Like, you're just in the terminal. You're waiting on your flight to arrive, And so just realize that was the land of your grief, but that God can make you fruitful in your grief. So in the place where you don't want to be, God can make you fruitful. Just like he made him, head of the household. He made him head of all the prisoners. God can make you fruitful wherever you are. And then in this situation, when the famine began, Pharaoh instructed everybody to go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. So I think that once you have that wisdom from God and you are, having that communication with God and you're close to God, people will start coming to you for advice. They'll start coming to you as to what to do. And just remember, when that happens, to give God all the glory. So that's my interpretation of Genesis chapter 41. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. Leave it in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope you stay blessed, stay in God's presence, and have a great rest of your day. I love you.